This is Carol from the STS. We are going to get started here with the new Data Manager Session 2 webinar with Melinda. Melinda's on the screen. Hi, Melinda. Thanks for presenting for us today. For those of you who are just joining, we are going to, if you are able to open up your Prac ID chart, you want to go to sts.org, Registries and Research, STS National Database, Adult Cardiac, Access Data Collection Resources, version 2.9, and then scroll down underneath Additional Resources and pull up the Procedure Identification chart. So there's that, and now I'm going to hand it over to Melinda. So thanks everybody for joining, and Melinda, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Carol. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say hi, put a face to a name so that you guys at least have an idea of what I look like when you're sending questions in and when I'm talking to you. So I hope everybody's having a great day so far. We're going to get started here. This is the new Data Managers Session number 2. So our learning objectives for this session is that we're going to understand the procedure ID and the risk variable chart, and we're going to also identify resources within the National Harvest Report. So we're going to talk about the Prac ID chart first, and a couple of things that I want to say just right off front. In order to read this chart, you're going to have your data collection form with the sequence numbers on it, so the annotated data collection form. Because as we go through this, you will notice that there's a lot of short names and sequence numbers, so you really need to have that handy in order to be able to read this chart properly. So we have Prac IDs for isolated CAB, isolated ABR, isolated MVR, ABR and CAB, MVR and CAB, ABR, MVR, isolated mitral valve repair, and CAB. So these are the analyzed cases, and these are the ones we have Prac IDs for.
Right. Melinda, is it okay if I just jump in real quick and just explain a little? Sorry for interrupting. The Prac ID chart is what Melinda's talking about. That these are procedures that we have identified as their procedure identification. These are the ones we have risk models for that get risk adjusted. So your outcomes and your outcomes are adjusted for the risk that the patient is entering the OR with. Sorry, Melinda.
No, great. I'm glad you jumped in and said that. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So the next slide, we're going to actually start looking to see what the Prac ID chart looks like. So when you look at this, you're like, oh my God, this looks kind of crazy. How do I read this thing? That's what a lot of people say. So what you have is you have these columns. So you'll see that the second column is isolated CAB. The first column is the variable with the name, the short name, and the sequence number. So you will also notice that there are white lines and gray lines. So the white lines are the things that are important for you to understand. The gray lines, like for example, where it says op cab N3/5, that's like computer lingo, program lingo. You don't really have to understand what those are, but you need to understand the stuff in the white. So for example, it says OpCap 2120, okay? So each sequence number you're going to go through. And so what you're going to do is you've got 4 here. We've got isolated CAB, isolated ABR, isolated MVR, ABR, and CAB. And then this scrolls down is what it does. So on the next slide, if Carol, scroll down, you'll see how the first column is still isolated CAB. And you scroll down, okay? So, for example, we've talked about the gray lines. That's where the red arrow is. That's computer programming lingo. You don't have to really focus on that, okay? So don't let that bother you from reading this chart. So for example, if you look at 6525. This is other cardiac congenital procedure 3. So that's the sequence number. And you look at the column over there, it's got some information. It says, is it missing? Is it no? Is it PFO, primary closure? Is it an anomalous origin of a coronary artery repair? So if you code it like this, it's like you say, if it's missing, it stays an isolated cab. If it's no, it stays an isolated cab. If it's just a PFO, primary closure, it stays an isolated cab. So if you kind of get the concept of this, so when you're looking at the stuff in the white, these are the things that how you code it will keep it into the isolated cab. And we'll do another one on another page. We'll show another example. Just scroll down to the next slide. Okay, so on this particular slide, you'll see where the columns have now become into one column, right? So everything for these sequence numbers, 3685, 3825, 3845, all of these affect your isolated cab, your isolated AVR, your isolated MVR. So they affect every one of these procedures because the column has become continuous now. So this is the bad timing. So you again can see if previous bad, explant, 3825, if you code yes, not during this procedure, it stays isolated. If you code no, it stays isolated. If it's missing, it stays isolated. Next slide. Okay, so on this slide, you can see that we have sequence numbers that affect all four, but we also have sequence numbers that affect just particular ones. So like, for example, the AFib intracardiac lesion, sequence 4040, it's going to affect the isolated cab, the isolated AVR. It affects those two, but it's not used in the MVR calculation. Okay, so you say it says not used in this calculation. So for example, if you had a cabbage that had, and you had an cardiac AFib lesion, you coded yes, you said yes to it, it would not be an isolated cab because in order for it to stay isolated, you have to code no or missing, okay? Next page. Okay, so another example I want to show you is the not used in this calculation. So for example, if you had a TMR done in that sequence 4110, you would come to your Prac ID chart and you see that sequence number 4110 and it says not used in this calculation. So that doesn't affect your isolated cab at all or your isolated AVR at all because it's not used at all in the calculation. So that would stay an isolated procedure. And then on the next page, I just want you to know that the first four categories that we've talked about, isolated cabbage, AVR, MVR, AVR, cab, all go down all the way through page 6. And then there's a total of 13 pages, and you'll see the other procedures that are analyzed and risk adjusted, starting after page 6. And it's the same concept, the same way to read it. So now we're going to do, just going to kind of summarize this a little bit and kind of go over some stuff. So just so you know how to read it. So the other card VSD 4130, that's the short name, okay? It's on your annotated form, data collection form, which is why it's important to read this with an annotated data collection form. It also gives you the sequence number, okay? On the Prac ID chart, no, this means if you code no to this field, then the procedure will stay isolated. Missing, this means if you leave this field missing, then the procedure will stay isolated. And again, ignore that gray line. It's computer lingo. Now, I've put a couple of months ago, we did a monthly educational call on the Prac ID chart. And this is the YouTube video. It's also can be accessed on the past webinars on the STS. So if you need more information, you want to further information, you can watch that video too. Right now, we're going to do some scenarios, and you guys get to answer some questions, and we'll see how everybody does with that. All right, Carol, next slide. And
Sorry about that. I was just answering a question here. Okay, let's go.
And we've got polling. So this is our first scenario. So a patient has a cabbage with AFib pulmonary vein isolation performed, which is sequence 4191. Will this procedure be classified as an isolated cab? Yes is A, B is no. Do we have the polling going, Carol?
Yep, it's open. Let me pull up maybe it'll be helpful if hold on one second. Let's see. Let me see, would it be helpful if we only have 3 people answered so far, so maybe we can pull up this Prac ID table and
go through that.
Yeah, you're going to look under the isolated cab section, which is this first section. Mm-hmm. And then you're looking for the sequence 4191 for pulmonary vein isolation. It's an AFib with pulmonary vein isolation. So I'm looking at the sequence numbers on the left-hand side here. Looking for 4191. And they're pretty much in order, but sometimes they might skip around. So just got to kind of, oh, here's 4191. Okay, so the choices that are going to keep it in the primary, in the isolated cab section, which is this first column, is if I chose primarily epicardial or missing. Now you're saying that the question is a patient has a cab with an AP pulmonary vein isolation. Is that the right field, Melinda?
Perform sequence 4191 is a pulmonary vein isolation, which is a primarily epicardial procedure. That's how you would code a pulmonary vein isolation.
Right. So so pulmonary vein isolations are primarily epicardial. So they do not go into the do not enter into the myocardium. They do not enter into the ventricle or the atriums to do this procedure. So
this procedure would stay an isolated cab.
Right. Let's see. Yep. Okay. And I'm not going to run through the next one. I'll let people try to figure it out. See what they come up with.
Now okay, so let's see what we got here. Now, so the next one is, if a mitral valve replacement is done with a procedure, with a tricuspid valve procedure, which is sequence 3646, will this procedure be classified as an isolated MVR? So maybe, Carol, if you got that Prac ID, we'll go through it, walk through it one more time with people.
Okay.
So we're looking for the mitral valve. So that's column number 3.
Here it is right there.
And we're going to go down and look for sequence 3646.
3646. So I'm going to look on the left-hand side here. 3646. 46.
Okay, so
And I'm just going slow because I know how to read it, I promise. But I'm going slow so you all can see the numbers as I'm going, that sometimes they're out of order, sometimes they're in order.
So one of the first things you're going to notice is it's not on this chart. So then what I'm going to look at is I'm going to start.
When I say, what the heck, Melinda? Yeah, why did you do that to me?
Well, I'm going to say, let's read. We know it's a tricuspid repair. So, hey, right there, it says tricuspid procedures. And then I'm going to go under column 3, which is my mitral valve. And it says, all tricuspid repairs are allowed. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that means that any tricuspid repair is going to keep your mitral valve replacement in the isolated category. Okay, so if it was a tricuspid replacement or a valvectomy, then it would be affected. But all repairs keep it isolated into the mitral valve, in the mitral valve replacement category. So sometimes if you don't find your number, read the names of these things and say, well, it is a tricuspid, and go to the column and see if there's a special note like there is one here. And you notice it's in green over there to the side, which at the beginning of this Prac ID chart, if you'll notice, the very top, it says green were new changes for the version 2.9. There was a little header at the top that said that on top of the Prac ID chart. Okay. All right, we have one more to look at, and hopefully this will help clarify it. So, patient has a CABG performed. During the procedure, the right ventricle is lacerated. A repair of the RV laceration is performed. I have coded this as a CABG with an unplanned other cardiac procedure, sequence 4135, due to surgical complication. Why is this case being classified as an other procedure since the RV repair was due to surgical complication? So we have two answers here. Note A is the classification must be incorrect because all unplanned surgical complications will keep the patient in the isolated category. And the answer for B is, for this field, 4135, it doesn't matter if it was for surgical complication or not. If other cardiac sequence 4135 is marked as no or missing, it will stay in the isolated category. So Carol, if we just pull that up real, because this is really important. So column 1, isolated cab, and we're going to go down to 4135 because that's the sequence number. $41.35 towards the bottom, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, there it is, $41.35. Okay, and it says if you code it as no, it will stay isolated. If you code it as missing, it will stay isolated. So in this instance, you can say yes to 2140 or 20 other cardiac procedure. You can say, is it 2120 or 2140? I can't remember. Can't believe it. It just went out of my head. So you can say yes to that under procedure. And yes to surgical complication right here, 2140. I was right the first time. And then, but when you get over to the M section, the other cardiac section, if this was a surgical complication, you're not going to code it sequence 4135, because if you do, your patient will fall out of the isolated category. And we don't want that to happen because this was a surgical complication. And it's pretty clearly laid out, I think, in the new training manual, not so clear in the older training manual, but I've got it pretty laid out pretty well in the new training manual. But if you have additional questions, just send them in. But I did want to point that out to everybody because that's pretty important piece of information to know. So the correct answer is B. For this field, 4135, it doesn't matter if it was for surgical complication or not. If other cardiac sequence 4135 is marked as no or missing, it will stay in the isolated category. So don't mark it if it's for a surgical complication, is the important thing takeaway here. All right, next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the risk model variable chart. This is also an additional resource, and it's under the adult cardiac section on the website under additional resources. It's important to understand a few things about this. The purpose of risk adjustment is to allow the STS participants to compare their performance with other participants. So sort of we're just accounting for and controlling patient risk factors that are present prior to surgery and kind of leveling the playing field. It is important to know, and this is the complete chart for this is found on page around page 20 to 23 of your National or Harvest Report. There are certain variables, for example, EF. If your EF is missing or less than 10, then the model will insert an EF for you, okay? And so it's important that you try to answer all of the questions that are on the risk model variable chart so that you have an accurate calculation of your patient's risk. Because if variables in the risk model chart are left blank, there will be a categorical variable in for you so that the risk can be calculated. And the only variable that we can't enter is the age. That is required for all models. So there has to be an age. Otherwise, we can't do a risk model on that. Okay. So here's what it looks like. We're not going to spend a great deal of time on it. I'm just going to kind of show you how to read it. So this is the risk model for the cabbage. You can see that up in the corner back there. And then you have operative mortality, stroke, renal failure. You've got all of these different metrics going across the top. And so, for example, if we look at operative mortality, then you look down the line and you'll see what plays into operative mortality, the ones with the X's. So age, gender, race, primary payer, insurance is important, okay? It is in your risk chart. Weight, height, diabetes, these are the things that play into your risk model. So it's important that you know what these variables are, and it's important that you try to get answers for these variables too, and not just leave them blank. I have seen sites before, just in my own experience, who just choose not to answer things like insurance and things like that. But it is important. So the next slide. So you can see that chronic lung disease is in there, CVA alcohol, HOMO2. So these are the components that are in the risk model for operative mortality for the cabbage patient. And on the next slide, it gets into previous interventions. It says if a PCI is in there, MIs are in there, heart failure's in there, NYHA class is in there. That's why it's important to try to work with your providers to get them to document that. It's in the risk model. Arrhythmias are in there. Next slide. Another one to point out that a lot of people probably aren't aware of is that mitral insufficiency, aortic insufficiency, and tricuspid insufficiency are in the risk models. Again, I've seen places that just don't fill that stuff out. but it is important. And on the next slide, I wanted to point out, because I get a lot of questions about this. The next slide, please. It has mechanical cardiac assist devices. So I get a lot of questions about, okay, I've had a balloon pump. The patient goes into the OR with the balloon pump, and then post-op, they take it out, but then they have to put another one back in. So when do I capture it? Okay, it's important to capture the pre-op one if you have that scenario, because the pre-op balloon pump, ECMO, and catheter assist devices are in the risk model when they're pre-op. Okay, so that's the important thing. Take away from this slide. All right, the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about the Sts Harvest Report. Some people call this the National Report. Some people call it the Harvest Report. I grew up calling it the Harvest Report just because I've been doing this for so long. And that's what it used to be called all the time. So this is what it looks like now. It, of course, is going to look different when we transition into IQVIA because it's going to be an electronic format. From what I understand, it will, the main informational sections will be static, a static document that will be in like a library resource area and downloadable for you. So these reports are published quarterly. It's also, and there's a lot of good information in here, like probably the first 120 pages is stuff that, you know, I know when I was a data manager, I really didn't take much time to read because I just wanted to get to those graphs and look at my results. And I would look at the stars and, you know, and then I would kind of skip over all that stuff that was just written down. But it's important to know that there's some really good information in there, and that's what we're gonna talk about on this call today. So the next slide. So I want to talk about this a little bit so that people understand OE ratios and odds ratios, because right now when your report comes out, you will see an odds ratio, an OE ratio, a risk-adjusted rate, an STS event rate. So sometimes those are really hard to understand. The next slide is going to show you the simplified version of how to understand that. This is the simplified version. So if your OE ratio is greater than 1, then you're performing worse than the expected. Okay. If your OE ratio is less than 1, then you're doing better than expected. And if it equals 1, just about average performance. So this is a real simplified version. This is my version, the non-statistical mind version. So when I look at my OE ratios, if it's greater than 1, I need to work on, that needs improvement. If it's less than 1, I'm doing great. And if it's 1, I'm okay. I'm still right at the expected, but I probably would rather be less than 1. So that's the real simplified version to help you how to read that. The next rate that was on that chart on the next slide is the risk adjustment rate, okay? And this is the simplified version too. So if your risk adjusted rate is greater than the STS event rate, then you are not doing as well as you should be doing, okay? If it's less, then you're doing better than the average participant. And if it's equal, you're just doing average, pretty much what everybody else is doing. So those are just the really simplified ways of how to read risk adjustment and numbers and OE ratios. Okay, next slide, please. All right, star ratings. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Everybody gets star ratings. Again, this is this will look a little different in the new reports. All of this stuff is going to look a little different, but the concepts and the information is the same. So you can either get 1, 2, or 3 stars. I will tell you from listening to many Dr. Shen's talks over the years that it's really, really hard for a low volume participant to get a 3-star rating just because of the curve. I don't quite understand all that, and I'll be honest, because I'm not a statistician, but I would think that 2 is pretty much average, okay? 3 is above, and 1 is below average. So definitely if you're 1 star in a certain area, you want to work on that particular area to at least get yourself up to 2 stars. Data completeness requirement, this is super important. So, and this has to do with mortality fields. So if you don't answer your mortality fields, if they're missing, or you put unknown in there, because that counts as missing. And for any time after 2017, and we're now into 2020, if 2% or higher of your mortality is missing or unknown, which counts as missing, you won't get a star rating. So that's super important to know that. So it is very important to complete the mortality fields. Next slide. When you look at the star rating, you're going to see that it rates you. You have an overall rating, an absence of mortality rating, an absence of morbidity rating, use of IMA, and medications. So the next slide, in the Harvest Report or the National Report, there's a whole page, and so I think it's around about 110, 115, and it talks about the domains so that you understand what absence of operative mortality means. You understand what absence of major morbidity means, okay? So, for example, domain number 2, major morbidity is defined as having at least one of the following adverse accounts. So, reoperation for any cardiac reason, renal failure, deep sternal wound infection, prolonged vent, CDA. So this resource will tell you what is in that domain and how is it measured. Just like domain 4 is perioperative medications. So what does that mean? Well, it means pre-op beta blocker therapy. It means discharge antiplatelet medication. It means discharge beta blocker. And it means discharge anti-lipid. And patients who didn't die, and patients who were actually discharged. Now, if you go to the next page, and this is the next slide, which is essentially the next page in the report we're talking about, it breaks it down. It breaks these domains down further. And the important things here is it has a numerator, it has a denominator, and it has exclusions, which is super important to see things that are excluded. So, for example, here, discharge beta blocker, exclusions. Okay, so right now it's the only exclusions if you die or if it was contraindicated. Those are your exclusions. Okay. If you come down to discharge anti-lipid, same thing. Either die or your discharge statin medication is contraindicated because it's really for statins. If you notice over here in column number 2, beginning in version 2.81, only statins are considered for this measure. So this is a really good, useful piece of information to familiarize yourself with. All right. The next slide goes into the report overview, and it tells you how to read. It tells you actually how to read this graph. So you can see, like, this is an overall score. You've got your participant score. That's your score down there, 97.7. Then you've got a mean participant score, the STS mean, which is 96.6. So you're higher than the STS, and appropriately you get 3 stars. And on the graph over there, you can see where you're at. It says participant, and you can see the minimum and the maximum score. So the minimum looks like it's 90, max is 98. So you can see the ranges of the scores. And it gives you the STS mean, which is that blue dot. So you can see where you're doing, how you're doing. So it's just a way, and in the national report, it goes over how to read all this. Okay. The next slide. This is really important also. And it actually breaks down the domains for you. So like any morbidity, okay, so it'll say reoperation only. You had 4 of those. Renal failure, you had 5. Deep sternal wound, you had 3. Prolonged vent, you had 26. Wow, that's a big problem, it seems like. Stroke, you had 6. Multiple morbidities, you had 12. So it'll break it down for you, okay? And then the other thing to notice here is that there are footnotes here. You see that, like renal failure only, and there's like that number 4 beside it up there. Well, what does that 4 mean? Okay, so if you come to the bottom, 4 says excludes patients with pre-op renal failure or last creatinine equal to or greater than 4. Okay, so if you have a patient that goes to surgery and his baseline creatinine, the one closest to entering the OR, was 4.2, he's going to be excluded from the renal failure metric because of that. So these footnotes are super important to read so that you understand. It gives you some really good information in the footnotes. All right. Next slide. Some housekeeping tips. It's recommended that you keep your data collection forms or your collection notes. Some people just use notes for at least 4 years in the event of an audit. It's also important to keep some sort of log of 30-day mortality, readmission, deep sternal wound, infection log. It can be an Excel spreadsheet. It could be, I used to use a piece of paper stapled onto my data collection form where I had either gone to the doctor's, the surgeon's office and checked all that stuff out, or called the patient, or however I found it, or looked in the chart, you know. So it just needs to be some sort of documentation or some sort of log as to how you do those things in case you're audited. Okay, next slide. So we're gonna, I know this was quick, but we wanted to have some time for questions. We're gonna try to answer as many questions as possible. Again, the purpose of these sessions were to familiarize people where resources are located, and as we see the need to provide further education in these areas, for example, we've already done one Prac ID educational call. We'll do those and spend a little more time. We just kind of wanted to share the resources with people so that they know where things are and how to use them.
Great, thanks, Melinda. So I think I'll read through some of these questions. I'll answer some, I'll hand some over to you. The first thing I want to mention is Melinda did a great job going through the Prac ID chart. It is confusing to look at it for the first time, and if you're not familiar with how to read it, it can be overwhelming. We did a webinar on April 1st that went through the Prac ID chart in a little bit more detail. Melinda's purpose was to provide you with information just so you're aware of it and kind of how it works. To get more information on it, you would want to go to the recordings of the webinars that we hold, and you could find them. Again, it's the sts.org. The fourth blue link is the registries and research, and then STS National Database. And then if you scroll down a little bit on the page, there's the live webinar section here. You could hit view webinars. These are going to be, it starts with the adult cardiac. So all of the databases are listed on the one page here. Starts with adult cardiac. These are the upcoming webinars that we have. And then if you go to past ACSD webinars, this webinar YouTube playlist has all of the webinars since October listed here. That's when we had started these. And then the most recent ones are listed here. The April 1st one is the webinar, the procedure identification chart. So I think this is the one you're going to want, and it'll take you to YouTube, and it is the link that Melinda had up there was correct. So this is the one you would want to watch.
If it was,
Oopsie, you don't want to listen to that too. So that's here. I suggest reviewing that, and we can always cover this further. I know it is confusing, and you're wondering why the heck do I need to know this, and all of that. So the purpose of the Prac Ids, what happens with the Prac Ids is every 10 years we develop risk models, and what risk modeling does is it allows us to identify where procedures will fall within a certain category. So we have isolated cabbages, we have isolated mitral valves, isolated aortic valves. Right now I think we have a total of 7 Prac Ids, procedure identifications, that are used for reporting purposes. We have an 8th one, which is a multi-valve, like an aortic, I think it's an aortic valve and mitral valve replacement that's not used yet, but we have a procedure identification for it. When I say it's not used yet, I mean that we do not have, we are not reporting out the outcomes using the risk adjustment. So what risk adjustment does is it takes your patient and with how they're entering the operating room, the risk that they're entering the operating room with, and the procedure. So it looks at all the risks, so heart failure, alcohol use, any lab values, if they were on HOMO2, anything that was in that chart that Melinda showed that was the risk model variable chart. Anything that's in that chart underneath, each of those endpoints that was at the top, like postoperative renal failure, prolonged vent, operative mortality, stroke. It looks at your patient entering the operating room, the risk that they have, the procedure that is performed, and the outcome that occurs. And it takes all of that, and then it says, we have these very robust risk models that is able to say, okay, with your patient that entered the operating room with all of these things going on and all of this procedure, we're expecting the outcomes for all of these endpoints to be this. So your patient might have a 3% chance of a stroke after surgery. And the reason we know it's a 3% chance of stroke is because of the way the risk algorithm works. So that's how we identify, and the procedure identification chart is specific, has specific parameters, because when the models were built, these were items. So the type of procedure that was performed, when the VAD is placed or when the ECMO is placed, any concomitant procedures that are done. So if it's a cabbage and they have an intracardiac or epicardial lesion done for AFib, we took all of that and we were able to say we have enough data to say that it's statistically significant that if a patient has a cabbage procedure and they have an epicardial lesion performed, that there is no increased or not a statistically significant increased chance of a poorer outcome. So that's how the risk models, and that's how that Prac ID chart gets built. The reason why you need to understand that is because we then compare apples to apples. So we have your patient at hospital A, we have your peers patient at hospital B. We are able to equalize those using risk adjustment to then compare those two patients. Even though they might have different risk factors, we're able to compare those patients as being equal, taking in the risks that they have going into the operating room. So I hope that explains it a little bit further, and we will explain it more. We can do a more dedicated session on risk modeling and the purposes of that. We will have a session at AQO to go over that, but hopefully that explains it just a little bit further. Leanne has posted the YouTube link to that recording to that April 1st webinar in the chat box. Thanks, Leanne, and then a link to all the webinars there. So I'm going to answer questions or go through questions and hand them over to you, Melinda. The first one is, what was the percentage of data? Oh, I can answer this. What was the percentage of data fields that have been reduced with the updated data collection tool that will be released in July? So we had approximately about a 30% reduction in data fields. We still maintain the granularity. The way the data fields were arranged, we were able to kind of streamline it, and we have about a 30% reduction in fields. And Melinda, do you want to go back through we have a question here for number 1. To go back through number 1, okay. Oopsie, where'd it go?
Okay, so number 1, the patient has a CAB with a pulmonary vein isolation, which was coded as sequence 4191, okay? So the question is this going to stay an isolated CAB? And the answer is yes, it'll stay an isolated CAB, because if you look at your Prac ID chart, you will see that sequence 4191, when it's is primarily epicardial, which is what a PVI is, that keeps it in the isolated category. So it will stay as an isolated CAB.
Yeah, the key thing there is that you would need to know that this pulmonary vein isolation is primarily epicardial. That's the key. What Melinda just said is that these pulmonary vein isolations, those are primarily epicardial AFib procedures. So if you don't know that and you're not sure how to code that, that's when you would submit an FAQ to Melinda, and she would help you out, explain that clinical side a little bit further.
Right, because as you can see, if you coded it as an intracardiac lesion, which is sequence 4040, and you said yes, it would throw it out of the isolated CAB. Okay, so epicardial lesions, keep it in the isolated category. Intracardiac lesions, take it out of the isolated category. Why is it important to be in the isolated category? Because those are your analyzed cases. And a lot of people want to have as many numerators and denominators in their isolated categories as possible.
We use the isolated categories. These are the procedures that get used in your star rating calculations. So we have the risk modeling are done to calculate your star rate. They ultimately end up being your star ratings, which get publicly reported. So the larger denominator you have, which means the more cases you have in your isolated categories, or which means the categories that get analyzed and risk adjusted, the more denominator you have, the more reliable your outcomes are going to be, which means your star ratings will be more reliable. So say you do 5 just as a very small number. Say you do 10 cabbages, and all 10 of those cabbages you're able to keep in the isolated category. And say you only have one of those cases that does poorly, they die. So that's, this is very simplifying the risk modeling, but you have then 9 cases that did really well, and you're able to say that those patients live. So you have, very simple, you have a 90% of your patients did well. If you only have 2 patients in your isolated cabbage category and one of those patients does bad, then you only have a 50% success rate. So the more cases that you have in the denominator, the more cases that stay in the isolated categories give you a better estimate of higher reliability of how your site's actually doing quality-wise, which then can be used for quality improvement at your site to identify areas for where there might be problems. that's in addition to what Melinda said. We also use these for star ratings, and sites use it for performance improvement. And so the next comment is the document would be easier to interpret if the column headers were on all pages and the gray rows were excluded, since we're ignoring those anyway. So we can't exclude the gray rows. You can just ignore them. The gray rows, we use those for programming, and there are some, this is our Prac ID chart that's developed along with some of the manuscripts that come out regarding the risk modeling, and we have sites that build these the risk algorithms themselves, so they need this programming coding. You just exclude them for yourselves. And version 4.2 will have the headers at the top of the rows. Okay, Melinda, next one's for you. What category would a mitral valve repair and tricuspid valve repair be?
Well, we have to look at the, I'd have to look at the Prac ID chart, because that's what I do. I look at the Prac ID chart. So we got, okay, so let's go down. We're going to be on the second, we have to go all the way to like page 7 to start with, because it's a mitral valve repair and a TV repair. So let's see, all the way to page 7. And, excuse me. Okay, so there's a mitral valve repair, Prac ID number 7, right there, 4th column over. And we are going to go scroll down till we find tricuspid repair. Oop, there it is in green. Okay, same thing. All tricuspid repairs are allowed. Okay, so it's going to stay an isolated mitral valve repair, because we don't have a Prac ID for MV repair and TB repair.
Right. The reason we keep all the tricuspid valve repairs in the mitral valve category, and this is kind of new from 2.9, when we redid the risk models. Our original last set of risk models were done in 2008. We then got enough data throughout the last 10 years. We redid them in 2017, went live with version 2.9 in July of 2017. And we then started including some of these tricuspid repairs, tricuspid procedures. And then there was another section, I think it had to do with some types of lesions that we were doing. The reasons why we then included these tricuspid repairs in the procedure identification, where it's not impacting if this procedure is going to stay a mitral valve repair or not. So what that means is that your patient has a mitral valve repair. It doesn't matter if the patient has a tricuspid valve repair or not. It's still going to be looked at as a mitral valve repair. And the reason we were able to do that is because we had enough data to say tricuspid valves repair, when done in conjunction with any of these procedures, do not show a statistically significant difference in outcomes. So that's why those tricuspid valves are allowed to keep that case in the mitral valve repair category. And I don't know if that's helpful to know that extra background information. To me it is, because it helps me make sense of things when I question it. But so this case, like Melinda said, stays in the mitral valve repair. This next question, Melinda, I think it got a little confusing. It's a little confusing when we say that this was an other operative. So this one says, if the patient has a ventricular tear unplanned during case, did you say not to mark sequence 2140 as unplanned complication?
No, we're gonna mark 2140. Okay, you can mark 2140, but what you're not gonna mark is if you go to section M. Can we pull up the data collection form, Carol? Do you have that?
Yeah, let me get it up.
See. So 2140 for the background is other cardiac procedure. Okay, so we're going to mark that, and we're going to say yes, unplanned due to surgical complication. And then we have to go to section M. Okay. So when you get to section M, if the procedure that was done is not on this list, it's included in section M. So it's because there's quite a few here. And you want to code it as sequence 4135, other cardiac procedure. Do not code it if it was for a surgical complication. Okay, because they're in the Prac ID chart. It doesn't matter for this one. So if it's a surgical complication or not, it's going to fall out of the isolated category. And you don't want it to fall out of the isolated category because it was a surgical complication. We want it to stay in the isolated category. So for example, if your patient had an unplanned VSD repair, now that's different because that's in the Prac ID chart, okay, in this list. That's different. You can code that. But this is for something, the example was a right ventricular laceration. There is nothing on this section M that says repair of a right ventricle tear. So the only place you could put it would be 4135. And what we're saying is don't put it there if it's a surgical complication. And it's very clearly lined out in the new training manual. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, so the reason and I'm just going to restate what you just said, just a little, sometimes maybe hearing it a couple of different ways will make more sense as people put pieces together. The reason why we wouldn't code that as 4135 cardiac other. So we did a CAB and the patient gets a right ventricular tear as a result of something that went wrong in the OR, an unplanned complication. So we code the cabbage at 2120, I think it is. And then we're looking, okay, we have this right ventricular tear. We're going to code that at other cardiac procedure because it is something else that was done. We're going to say, okay, it's 2140. We're going to say it's unplanned due to surgical complication because that was something bad that happened in the OR that wasn't supposed to happen. And then we're going to go to section M. Now, normally what would happen if it wasn't, and this doesn't necessarily just relate to right ventricular tears. It could be any other complication that's not listed on this sheet that is that is done because of an unplanned complication in the OR. You don't have an option here to code it in these options here. Your first instinct is, oh, I need to code that as other cardiac procedure because something else was done. However, if you code it as other cardiac procedure and it's an unplanned due to surgical complication, it's going to move it out of, so 4135, it's going to, and you code it as, yes, other cardiac, it's going to move it into the other, it's going to take it out of the isolated category and it's going to make it a non-analyzed case or non-risk adjusted case. However, that's inappropriate because what happens when a surgeon does the surgery and something happens bad in the OR, the intent is that we should be analyzing those cases as the intended procedure. So that cabbage should actually stay in the isolated cabbage category, and we do not want to capture this field here, 4135, because it would move it out. It comes down to a programming kind of issue when this happens and it's other unplanned. There's a very small number of cases that this happens to. So we wouldn't code it as the other cardiac for 4135 because what we say at the database is if the surgeon broke it, then the surgeon's responsible to fix it and it affects their outcomes. It doesn't remove that patient from being analyzed. They broke it, they fix it, they own it. So they did an isolated CAB, they accidentally lacerated the right ventricle, they should have that category. Patient should stay in the isolated CAB category. They get analyzed with all of the rest of the isolated cabbage category. We're not going to code this as an other cardiac other because it would move it out of the isolated category. So you want to keep it in the isolated category so it gets analyzed even with the rest of the other cases. That one's a really confusing, that whole example is rather confusing. So the best thing to do is that if you're unsure is to please submit it into the FAQ mailbox, and then we can review it and provide you more, Melinda can provide you more guidance on that. I think those are kind of tricky ones.
Oh yeah, and the only reason I brought it up is I get quite a few questions about that exact thing, and that's why it's been addressed pretty clearly in the new training manual. Not so much in the old training manual, you know, I'll admit it, but it was every time I got an FAQ, it was addressed real clearly. So it's just an awareness so that people are aware of this.
Yeah, and if you, and like I said, submit an FAQ so Melinda can answer it, so you're not guessing in. If you were to get audited, you don't get it marked wrong or whatever. There's just a few questions here about the star ratings and things like that. So the next star rating is actually, the next one that's due out is actually the data that was harvested for Harvest 1 2020. That report we're expected to be out in the summertime. This is related to our transition with IQVIA and the bidirectional data exchange with DCRI and IQVIA, which is a new process that we started with our transition in January. So we hope to have that report out soon. The data is at DCRI being analyzed now. And as soon as we have that, we'll be doing demonstrations with the benchmarked dashboard. And those star ratings are updated twice a year for adult cardiac. And this webinar will be posted on the website at that spot under that link that Leanne posted in the chat box. It says link to webinars on the STS website. Do you have a few more minutes, Melinda?
Yeah, I have a few more minutes.
Okay. This one's for you. Can you clarify additional tricuspid replacements for isolated surgical complications or not? I think you did. You think you covered that one. And then,
can you clarify tricuspid replacement? Replacement is totally different than repair. And that will throw it out. It won't stay in the ice. If you do a mitral valve replacement and a tricuspid replacement, it's going to be thrown out. It won't be an isolated mitral valve replacement. Yeah. Tricuspid replacements and valvectomies are allowed. So if you code yes to a replacement, then this will not be an isolated mitral valve.
okay. Next question, and then same person. Well, how about the heart failure classification in EF? Why only HF timing? So I'm not sure what chart we're talking about here.
We're probably talking about the risk variable chart, and it has the timing of heart failure. I'm assuming that's what she's talking about. Heart failure timing. That plays into it. Send me an email and I'll send you all the coefficients so that you can determine which timing affects it. Each one of these variables has a coefficient that goes along with it. So happy to share that if you want to look at that.
Great, thanks, Melinda. And then are you telling us don't use, because I think we just covered that other cardiac when it's due to a complication, right? So if it's an other cardiac due to a unplanned surgical complication and it is not on that list, right, Melinda?
Yeah, if it's not on the list in section M.
Okay.
That's correct.
So missing data percentage, is it just the 30-day follow-up field? No, there's 3 fields that play into that 2% missingness that you, 2% threshold that's required, and I don't have those right in front of me. I would have to, let me see if I can find them easily.
It's a 30-day for sure, and
I have to pull up the 999 report. I don't have access to my to the reports right now. But there's 3 fields that play into it. It's listed in your report overview. If you have access to one of your last reports, it's listed in the report overview. Did you have it on
I think I did. Just had to go through it pretty quickly because it's a lot of information for an hour.
Yeah. Oh, here it is. These 3 fields here. So discharge mort stat for sequence these are for version 2.9. The discharge mort stat, the mortality 30-day stat, and the mortality discharge. I think this is the mortality death field. Are all the 3 fields that you need to meet the 2% threshold for on cases starting in January 1st, 2017. How would a patient refusal to take anti-lipid meds affect the domain?
Well, I'm real happy to announce that in version 4.2, it's going to be different. Right now in version 2.9, patient refusal counts as a no. Okay, but in version 4.2, surgeon leadership felt like if patient refusal was documented clearly, very clearly in the medical record that you explained it to the patient refused to take the medication, that we can now code that as contraindicated.
Great, thank you. Next question, are there NQF endorsed measures for any other model except isolated CAP? So we do have the other Prac Ids do have NQF endorsed measures with them. You can find them, this is again sts.org, and then under quality and safety performance measures, we'll bring you to this page here. It starts off with the cabbage, and you can see what procedures are impacted or what procedures apply to this and what types of measures we have here, the 3rd and 4th column. These are all related to cabbages, and then we have isolated AVRs and isolated MVRs, isolated mitral valve repairs, and mitral valve repair replacements, cabbages, MVR cabbage, AVR cabbage, mitral valve repair cabbage, aortic valve replacement cabbage, mitral valve repair replacement cabbage. So you can find those all here at the quality and then performance measures. Will the report overview section still be available in IQVIA? I thought the PDF report was going away. So the PDF report is being transformed into the dashboard reporting. The PDF report, the report overview section is more of a static report, and it doesn't change a whole lot between quarterly reports that will be posted in the library. Probably we'll clean it up. We have to clean it up and make sure it's relevant and up to date and all that stuff, but it will be posted in the library with this information regarding the risk modeling and the ODE ratios that Melinda went over. What is a min-max score?
I don't know if she's referring to the score like on the stars. I'm not exactly sure. Send me an FAQ and I'll be happy to help you.
Okay. And maybe we can go on for about 4 more minutes. Melinda, we'll go to quarter after if that's okay. Yeah,
I think we should definitely address the data collection form because...
Oh yeah, so let's talk about that. So not everybody uses the paper data collection forms, which is totally okay. If you abstract right into your vendor software, when we have direct data entry, you abstract directly into the electronic form, that's totally okay. For sites who use the paper data collection forms, which most still do, for sites who use the paper data collection forms, the reason we want you to save that we suggest saving it for 4 years is if you were to get audited, we can go back as far as 3 years on the valve. You may have to go back as far as I think it's 3 years, or not, I'm sorry, not if you get audited. That's why you would want to keep it for a year. But if you have your reports go back as far as 3 years. So the report that we collected in January that contains valve data that will go back as far as it'll include 2019, 2018, and 2017. So you would want to hold on to those records in case you have questions about mortality status, say the threshold for missingness is different from in between there. It's not, it's still 2% for those years, but those are reasons why you would want to save it for those 4 years going back.
And I think the discrepancy, we said 3 years before, now we're saying it 4 years. And I think the reason we're saying 3 to 4 years is because some people count their years different, like it's 2020 now, but 2017 was, in my mind, 3 years ago, but some people might count that as 4 years ago. So it depends on, that's why we're giving a little leeway, 3 to 4 years, because you want to make sure that, like Carol said, if you have questions or concerns about any reports or the audits, sometimes the audits used to be quite a ways behind. They're not as far behind now as they used to be in the past. And that's kind of where we came up with the 3 years before, because the audits were a couple years behind. So I think that's sort of why we're saying 3 to 4 years. I know one place it says 3 years, and I presented it 3 years. Yesterday when Carol and I were talking about these slides, she said, well, maybe we should say 4 years because of the reporting and how do we know how people count their years. So just to cover bases.
Yeah, good point, Melinda. Are the multiple morbidities just based on the major morbidities, or does it also include the minor ones? So when you're looking at morbidities, I guess we could look at the composite, the CABG composite. It's based on these morbidities. So stroke, CVA, surgical re-exploration, and this is any surgical re-exploration, deep sternal wound infection, postoperative renal failure, and prolonged vent are the morbidities that are used in the composite model and for reporting. Would PCI post-CABG be included as a re-intervention? So
well, Vonnie, it depends. So send me a question because I need to know if that PCI was planned prior to the CABG or during the CABG, or it depends.
Yeah, and if it was planned, it needs to be documented in the pre-operative notes.
Or the op note.
Mm-hmm. Right before the patient leaves the operating room.
Yeah.
Can we get copies of the documents you just showed? So the documents are available on the STS website under Registries and Research, STS National Database, and then the Adult Cardiac Database. And when you go there, you access the data collection resources version, under version 2.9 for right now, and then they're all down here. We were using the Prac Ids procedure identification chart today and the risk model variable chart today. When the June harvest report is available, will we get an email from STS? You'll probably get confetti in the mail because we'll be so happy to have it out and posted and ready to go. So yeah, we'll definitely make sure that everybody is aware when that report comes out. We'll send out emails and we'll also be reporting it on the webinars. And I believe when you log into IQVIA under the notification tab, we can also work with them to make sure they put notification up there. If Plavix is ordered but not aspirin, does that count as a fallout? It's a good question. So I think Plavix is a P2Y12 inhibitor.
You go to slide 30, we can show the exclusions. It's right there.
What slide am I on?
Oh, let's see. I don't know. Let's see. You're on. Go up a little further. No, down a little further. Down a little bit further. Down. There we go. Okay, you just passed it. Exclusions. Discharge aspirin or discharge P2Y12 antagonism or other discharge antiplatelet is marked contraindicated. So if you go home on aspirin or a Plavix or an other antiplatelet.
Are these from 2.9 and 2.81, or are these 2.9? Because I don't think we collect P2Y12s at discharge, do we?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Melinda.
We have to pull it up. We can pull it up just to make sure, but this is a document where you find all of that type of information. And that's in your national report or your harvest report. There's antiplatelet at discharge right there. There we go. Or even here.
Yeah, we collect on the P2Ys are under other discharge antiplatelets, I believe.
Yeah. So if you go home on Plavix, you're okay. It's not a fallout because you went home on Plavix.
Good. Well, the metrics changed on July 1st with the new version. No, the risk models are just being updated with mapping. So things that we may have changed, like change the way that they're collected. Like, for example, the race fields, we used to collect each individual race field as a yes or no, and now we've collected it at one field with multi-select options. Those things will change in the risk model algorithm, but the metrics and anything related to the reporting is not changing.
Looks like we've answered all the way down. There's a comment about the audit log down there.
On the log for 30-day follow-up, I keep a log when I call patients back with the date, time, person talked to, and audit was told that wasn't enough.
Well, my first question is, told it wasn't enough in respect to mortality or in respect to readmission? That would be my first question.
Yeah, and if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to, we can review this. I can review it, we can look at it further and make sure we understand and get you the right answer on that one. And I put my email in the thing in the chat box. Okay. And then just one last question, just to clarify. I thought we were getting different STAR reports after DCRI is finished with this. After DCRI is finished with the STAR report, so it will look different than what Melinda has shown. But the reason Melinda had to show what she did is because that's what we have available right now. It will be available in I guess an electronic type of format, very similar to what the STAR reports look like before. It will be a more user-friendly and, of course, electronic. Once we have that available, Melinda will be able to update her slides with those types of information and screenshots, and we'll do a lot of education to make sure everybody's on the same page for reading those reports.
Oh, can I answer one more?
Okay.
And then that's it. It says, would the RV laceration be considered trauma? No. If that's surgical induced trauma. I get a lot of questions about this. So the trauma in section M is cardiac trauma, like, blunt trauma, you get gunshot wound, car wreck, fall off the bridge, that kind of trauma, okay? Not surgical induced trauma.
Great, that's right. No surgical induced trauma. If it happens in the OR and it's trauma, it's an unplanned related to surgical complication and not coded as trauma. Okay, are we good, Melinda?
I think
you did a great job.
There's so many questions. I'm sorry, guys. We'll try to, we'll just keep trying to provide more education. If there's something we didn't address, just send me an FAQ, and thanks everybody for participating.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great job, Melinda. Thank you everybody for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Carol. Bye, everybody.
Bye, thanks.